Welcome to Creation to Restoration, the podcast that explores behind the scenes of the biblical timeline. With your hosts, Randall Owens and Andy Patt.
Good morning, Andy.
Morning, Randall. How you doing today?
I'm doing really, really well. And as we get cranked up, I want everybody to know that we are going to be today beginning Genesis 2. We've covered everything that we wanted to cover from 1, and now we're jumping into Genesis 2. And I want to say before we get too far into this, just to let people know, as we're working through this, we've been kind of hitting these things a verse at a time and going very slowly through material, but we're not always going to do that. We're in this creation story, so we had to kind of hit things individually, but we're not going to continue to do this. Or how many centuries would it take us to get through the Bible?
Yeah, well, and to that point, I mean, I've spent most of my life in this one very refined topic, and the reason why I think it's important for us to do the due diligence up front, at least with this particular section, is it's the bedrock of Christian understanding upon which we build everything else. So taking a little bit more time just to hammer out, because it is so foundational, it's also one of the most attacked parts of our Christian framework, because if you can undermine the foundation, put a crack in that foundation, then the house can fall. It makes everything weaker to attack. And that's what we see in schools, to our children, to people all over the place. It's one of the main attack vectors, and we're warned about that later in the New Testament too, to be mindful of that.
Yeah, it's one of those things also when I think, and I'll watch these episodes back and all like that, I'll think, hey, Randall really doesn't have very much to say, does he? But it's because Andy's so full of knowledge on this area. I just like to wind you up and let you go.
Yeah, there'll be plenty of time in the future for me to be quiet and for you to just share everything that you got. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Well, here's what we're going to do. Like I said, we're in Genesis 2, so I'm going to read. We're going to start with verses 1 through 3, so I'm going to read that, and then we'll jump in and start to talk about this. Actually, you know what? Let's just stop at verse 1. So here we go. Genesis 2, verse 1 says, "Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them." Mm-hmm. Now, that wouldn't seem like it's that big a deal. It's like, okay, yeah, of course, we know that. But what's special about that when you see, "and all the host of them"?
Yeah, so I think my first thought is to think to Exodus. In 6 days God made the heavens, the earth, and all that in them is.
Yep.
But while it's similar, it's actually a little bit more specific in one direct regard. Mm-hmm.
So when I think about that as like the host of them, so now we get into things like the divine council and things like the angels and the other spiritual beings that were all created that are the heavenly hosts.
Correct.
Right? And so you start to think about this. Now, and the word host, if you look that up in the Hebrew of what that's talking about, you see the idea of an army. You see the idea of this large military kind of thing. And again, and that's not their only function, of course, but this host, this multitude of the spiritual beings that were created, again, before man, but still right there in that first sentence of Genesis 1. But here it is repeated again, Genesis 2:1. "Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them." Now, and part of that could be, of course, speaking a little bit towards the, some people would say, the sun, the moon, the stars of the host of the heavens and all like that. Mm-hmm. But looking at this, there's a little bit of a different thought there each way. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think it's one of those situations where it is a term that is interpreted differently, can be interpreted differently, but I think one of the things that we often fail to do is include one of the correct interpretations. If these things are all simultaneously true, we don't omit the one which includes the fact that the angels are in view here, because a lot of people will try to, and Satan himself definitely tries to elevate his being, his persona, his character, to something approaching godhood, if not trying to supplant himself like God. What does he say? "I shall be like the Most High."
Right, that's what he wanted.
And this is one of those important concepts to keep our in our heads, is that they are created beings, first and foremost, and they are absolutely categorically different. They had an origin. They were made by God, just like we were, just like the heavens were, just like the earth was. And therefore, they can never be equated with God in any real sense. And so it helps prevent the kinds of attacks and the kinds of deceptions that come in. And when you examine every other religion on the planet, what they're worshiping and elevating to godhood, this is one of those check verses against that, to say, no, these were all created by the real God.
Right. One of the phrases that I love from that Dr. Michael Heiser used to use all the time is that Yahweh, the Creator God, is species unique.
Correct.
There is none like Him. Like everything that exists, He created, but nothing created Him. He is, again, as an eternal spiritual being, always been there, always will, always has. There's just, and as humans, I mean, how in the world do we wrap our heads around that?
No chance.
We can only understand inside of time, because that's how our brains work. You know, we think about yesterday, today, tomorrow, but that's not how he's made up and how he thinks about things.
No, I mean, yeah, and then time is one prison, if you will. Up, down, left, right is another.
Yep.
You know, just the fact that we're in this confined space and God is just transcendent and supersedes all of that. And, you know, we look at the angelic realm, which supersedes where we're at, and God's above that. So it's just orders of magnitude to a degree that is immeasurable.
Yeah, and once we get into speaking about specific spiritual beings like Lucifer, as we get down the road in the coming months and weeks and all like that, you start to see that the desire that he had for wanting to be like God, you know, but there's no chance. I mean, he was a created being. God wasn't. So lots of things like that to be talking about. But if we think about it, are you ready to move on to verse 2 of chapter 2?
I mean, that's asking a lot. We don't go that fast, do we?
Do you have any other thoughts on the host of heaven that we're now the summation statement of everything was created and finished, and the host of heaven with them?
Yeah, I mean, apart from just my favorite thought with regards to the hosts of heaven, which is to say, who is the commander of the Lord's host? Who is it that Joshua encounters when they're on their way to battle, on their way to Jericho? You know, and he says, you know, Joshua meets eyes with him, Joshua 5:13. He goes, art thou for us or for our adversaries? And he says, nay, but as the captain of the host of the Lord, I am now come. And we just see one of these encounters of Jesus Christ. And he's always held up as the commander of angel armies. And so, yeah, that same word that we see is, you know, in the hosts of them is that which Christ commands.
All right, now this makes me think of something. We like to, think about, you know, is God on our side? And God's clearly saying what's going on. Because in that situation, you had two human armies that didn't like each other and are going to go to battle, right? And now the angel of the Lord, Christophany, if you will, here's Jesus, and Joshua's saying, now, are you with us? Are you with them? And he doesn't. He says, no, I'm with the armies of the Lord. So there's this third thing happening, and today I can't help but think about how many people seriously pray for their football team to win, and I'm thinking, what is wrong with you? You know, do you really think God cares?
Right.
If your team wins?
Well, and fair enough.
Know?
So, and what happens in that immediately after the part that I just read, Joshua's sitting here, he's going in commanding this army. Are you with us? Are you with our enemies? He goes, no, but as the captain of the host of the Lord, I am come. Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped him.
Yes.
So,
yes.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Here's your response.
Yeah.
Quit trying to... As a human, we should stop trying to get God on board with our plans and our desires and our wishes. Our job is to get on board with his plans and his desires and his wishes. And that's the whole point, right? Is that God has got his agenda, God's got his plan, and we've been reading through the beginnings of what God was willing to share with us about those plans. And so as we go through and we start to understand, it's like, this is his story.
Right.
This is the story that he's bringing to life, and he's giving us what we need to know.
Yes, yeah, which is going to, in Genesis 1 through 11, set the foundation for and answer everything that we'll encounter elsewhere. Like, nothing that is later doesn't have a basis in Genesis. So this is really building the foundation in some serious ways. It gives us a framework for the rest of it, including the hosts, when we see those later.
Yeah, and that's going to come into play a bunch as we do this podcast, throughout the coming years, I would say. All right, so now I'm going to move on. We got Genesis chapter 2, verse number 2. And on the seventh day, God finished his work that he had done. And he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. And then again, verse 3, so God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. So God rests. When we think about that, what do you think that meant originally? When we're thinking about, okay, this seventh day of creation, God rested. What was really happening there, Andy? Is it just as simple as it sounds?
So I doubt he was tired.
Yeah, exactly.
If you want to put it that way.
Yes.
No, so there's a lot of conversation about this. It doesn't say much in this passage, but we see later Christ commentating on this and basically saying that the Sabbath and well, I guess even rewind from there, when the Sabbath is instituted in the law, it's brought up as remember.
Right.
The Sabbath.
Right.
So
yes.
the Sabbath was something that was being instituted on this day of rest. This was done because Adam had been created now. He after his first nap, goes to bed on the day he's made, wakes up, and God teaches him the Sabbath. So this is instituting something that's going to be important going forward. And we see when Christ commentates on that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So it has more to do with getting us to the point where we are ensuring we have the time set aside for our relationship with the Lord, and not toiling ourselves to the point of putting every other thing before God. It's taking that time to remember to work on that relationship also.
Yeah, well, let's jump into that a little bit. Again, we see that God rested. Again, Genesis 2:2. On the seventh day he rested, but we don't see the word Sabbath in that anywhere.
No.
Right? So when we start to see the Sabbath, again, you get to Exodus 20, and it's the whole the command, which is the fourth commandment. Exodus 20 is the 10 Commandments. And so you get to verse 8, and then 8 through 11, 4 verses talk about this one concept. I'm going to read this, and you start thinking about what things jump out to you in it.
Sure.
So Exodus 20, 8 through 11 says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So to me, before you jump in here, is understand what the word Sabbath means. That's not really a word we use too much in modern times. But again, you look this up in the biblical dictionary, and it just means to rest or cease. It's a pause. One of the definitions came in as intermission. And you see this again. God is. We like to think about God as working through. He rested from his creation, but that didn't mean he was done doing everything he wanted to do. Again, not creating other things, but God's working through situations. But this is an intermission. It's a rest. It's a pause, if you will. What jumps out to you in that whole thing?
Yeah, and even just as you were talking about it right there, the idea of what it means is rest. And then you see, like in Psalm 46, be still and know that I am the Lord. So it kind of gets back to that idea of, it's very easy to become task and goal oriented. And then for suddenly the pursuit of those goals, overwhelming, becoming all encompassing, and ultimately out prioritizing other things that should matter in life. Having a regular scheduled, whether it's on a given day or not, but having a regular cadence of pausing, stopping, resting, knowing that he is God, that he's responsible for the results in our life. Whatever it is that you're going through with everything else going on, it's always important to remember to take that rest and to take that time with the Lord. And it comes up all throughout the scriptures.
So when we think about this, we see it in the law, right? We see it, and it's number 4 of the top 10 for God, and he brings that about. So you see, he's established this thing, and he talks about what you're supposed to do. But now, when we see that later, the Pharisees have expanded that a little bit.
Yeah.
By the time we get to the New Testament, we're looking at all the rules and regulations and everything. This is what you're allowed to do, but you're not allowed to do these things over here. How they started to define work. You're not supposed to work. I mean, you're supposed to be resting. You're supposed to be, meditating on God and His Word and all these things. But if you did anything, it's like they couldn't even cook. Once they got into, you had to prepare the meal the day before, I think it was. So there's so many extra things that they've put into it that, well, if you want my opinion, they didn't need to put into it, right? God summed it up, and then they went crazy with the details.
Yeah, and that's something that Christ addressed throughout his ministry and his time, and I think part of it is to do with the new covenant, but then another part of it is just trying to get people to remember, hey, God has instituted these things for a reason, for a purpose. We talk about in a legal sense the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law, and Christ is trying to point them back to what's God's heart for you and for your relationships, both with other people and with Him. And the commandments, the laws, the rules are about how to apply God's intentions and His heart and His desires for mankind in a civil fashion. It's not meant to be some dictatorial edict that is controlling over everybody. And that's where in modern Christianity we get that term legalism. It's like, oh, you're trying to control me with this, that, and the other rule. Don't you know about my liberty? So, yeah.
Well, but that's exactly what the Pharisees were doing by the time we get to the New Testament. I mean, and the example is fantastic because that's what you even brought up. Again, the Sabbath is made for man, and we're going to get to that scripture in just a minute. But here's an interesting thing that we think about the fourth commandment, this Sabbath commandment. It's the only one of the 10 commandments that does not show up in its original form like that in the New Testament. We see don't be killing people. We see don't be lying. We see all this stuff from the top 10 list of God's 10 commandments show up in the New Testament. But this one specifically we don't see in the same way. Because as the New Testament talks about, Jesus has now become our rest, spiritually speaking, and all like that. Now, there's still an element of need, as you said earlier, that we need to rest. We need to relax for a day. We need to stop this idea of being, an American workaholic. Because what is that trying to get you? That's getting you nowhere but ahead in the world system. We're supposed to be pulling away from that, not going all in for it, right?
Well, in the same similar vein, at least. When you get to the New Testament, towards the end there in Revelation, and you get to chapters 2 and 3, and you've got the report cards that Christ is offering to the church, and He's starting to grade the churches on how they're doing. And the very first one is, the letter to Ephesus. And what's going on there? Well, they're not getting ahead for the world's sake. They're just knuckle grinding it out for the kingdom's sake. And he goes, you lost your first love. You're so busy on the business of the king, you forgot to spend time with the king.
Wow.
There's still that point, no matter what your endeavor, you're never going to rationalize something to say, well, my addiction to working is just and holy and righteous. And God said, no, you still need to pause. You still need to rest. I still need you to be still and know that I'm God. And that relationship is critical and paramount.
How many church leaders, pastors, have sacrificed their family and their own sanity at the cost of being at the beck and call of every person in the congregation.
Right.
They never have an off switch to say, I just can't do that right now. I need to get away from all of this stuff. I need to rest for a while. And I even see that in our small congregation here. It's currently we're at about 65 people. We've only been going a short time. But even at that, I think to myself, when I know the phone calls I get and the emails I get, at any given time, there are, at the minimum, 3 to 4 people with a major crisis in their life. So if you want to do nothing but ministry 24/7, you could do it.
Oh, yeah. And
that flies in the face of what God has asked us to do and said, listen, this is very important. I know ministry is important, he says, but now this, I won't be any good to help anybody else if I let this just continue to grind on me for, again, like I said, 24/7.
Yeah, and so in kind of getting to that, one of the things you brought up was the fact that there's a difference in the way that the Sabbath is mentioned in New Testament versus Old Testament, and it's not stated or reiterated in any kind of a way that's similar to the law.
Right.
But there's a key distinction too, that Christ is our rest.
Mm-hmm.
Well, apart from not Christ just being the rest, Christ is now in us, and the Holy Spirit is now in us. Before, what was the Sabbath? They would go to the tabernacle. They would go to the temple. They would go to worship. They had to go to where God was, and God is now where we are. So our rest can take place at different times, different ways, because we have been able to internalize, been able to be indwelled by the Spirit, and so our worship doesn't require to be geolocated in one given area. We can
Right.
perform these things in any one place. The closeness is there, and it's all the more intimate, the relationship that we have with God from what was available to them back then, which I think even almost makes it more painful, more egregious when we take advantage of that or forget that, and then still push them aside to just get busy. And it's but it's a real trap. It's the first one that Christ addressed with his church when he comes back to give them a report card.
Wow. So speaking of what Jesus thought about this, we see that in Mark 2, and the whole story is from verses 23 through 28. So again, I'm gonna read this, and then let's so be thinking about what we want to pull out of this to talk about it, because this is one of those deals where the Pharisees wanted to get involved and get mad because, Jesus and his disciples are not following the laws that they had written about the Sabbath, right? So here it is, starting at verse 23 of Mark chapter 2. It says, "One Sabbath he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, 'Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?' And he said to them, 'Have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry, and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar, the high priest, and he ate the bread of presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat. And also he gave it to those who were with him. And he said to them, The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath.'" What was he trying to say there?
Well, I mean, I think he called himself God there for one. For everyone who wants to argue that Jesus never claimed to be God.
That's right.
Yeah. There's this concept that we see brought up in other places about the leaven of the Pharisees. And, we know the idiom of leaven being equated to sin and corruption. And specifically, what was the error of the Pharisees? What was the leaven of the Pharisees that was being warned about, and is warned about also with regards to the church in the New Testament era? It's this idea of these strictures, these ordinations of men, these additional things that we've added to the scriptures. Kind of the visualization I've heard before and I liked was that, if there's a gaping chasm and you take one step over that ledge and you're toast, and Christ is saying, okay, see this ledge right here? Don't cross this line. And the Pharisees come along and said, ooh, that looks bad. So what we're going to do is we're going to erect a fence, 5 feet from the line. And we're going to treat you and punish you so as you wish you fell off that ledge if you even cross our fence. And so it's this idea of putting boundaries and barriers and buffer zones. So, and that was their justification for it, was that, hey, we don't want anyone going under that gorge over there, so we're going to go ahead and put this fence up so they can't even get to the line. And Christ is saying, hey, man, there is liberty and there is, goodness for you. There is opportunity. There are things that are that I have intended for you, even all the way up to that line. This is the breadth of everything that I've given to you for blessing and for good. And you've just robbed everyone of all of that land that was set aside right there. And it's important that we don't, even when we see the fence, misconstrue the fact that that's not God's heart, God's law. That's something that men do, and it is a corruption. It's used for control, and it ultimately steals from the kind of joy and peace and liberty that we're supposed to have in Christ. So
this Sabbath concept now, in a legalistic term, you'll see people that go to a very I'll just say legalistic church that would be so upset for somebody that, has a job that requires them to work on Sunday.
Right.
And yet they don't have any problem going out to eat right after church.
Making everybody else work.
And making sure that everybody else is there to serve them on that day. So you see how, hypocritical in this whole idea. The more rules you set, so it's, what is it they say? Rules for thee, but none for me.
Right.
Right.
Yes.
And this is like, that's just crazy understanding. When you look at that last phrase, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath.
Right.
When in the last phrase in verse 27. And so you start to say, oh, well, he's instituted a day of rest, a pause, an intermission from what we're to be about doing, whether it's secular work or whether it's ministry work or whatever it is. He wants us to have this time that we can stop and we can relax and we can refocus and be about what he wants us to do. So that's...
Well, yeah, and the point of the rest was to connect with God, to be able to worship, and you used to have to go to a place of worship. And then the last verse 28, the Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath. So now our worship is with us. Our worship is with the Son of Man, to the Son of Man. We worship Jesus Christ, and therefore we don't need to go. It doesn't need to be fixed, but it's important that we still do it. We still need to have that time of worship.
So we haven't broken any sort of law
Right.
if we spend one Sunday at the lake. Now, I'm not going to propose you should make a habit of that.
Right.
I think you need to be around other believers and all like that. But there's no, oh my goodness, you've ruined everything if you've taken a day off from
Right.
from being with the believers.
Well, and yeah, so I think the critical part of what you just said there is, again, breaking from the Sabbath mindset of you have to pick a specific day where we all congregate.
Right, the legal part of it.
The part that Christ does, I think, I don't know if it's right in calling it a command, but it feels like it's a command, is that we are amongst other believers, that we form and act as a body. That is something that we're called to do.
Absolutely.
And so if it just happens to be one of those things where the boat is really nice and the lake is really pretty and you're never there on Sunday and you fail to congregate with other believers outside of Sunday, then you have a problem.
That's correct. So
Yes.
you've turned it into more than just I'm missing out on my fellowship with believers,
Right.
but I'm still keeping the Sabbath out on the lake, right? Right?
Yeah, no,
But
yeah, we
once
gotta-
you get to the point where you have, again, seared your heart over with, I don't care if I go back to church or not. I can't tell you how many people that I've had tell me, I commune with God out in nature. I don't need to go to church.
Or how about this one? I watch church online.
Uh-oh. There you go. Again, you cannot do life alone. Where are you going to put the gift that God put in you? The spiritual gift that he's given you, that he expects you to use for what? The edification of the body. Mm-hmm. If you're never with the body. That makes that very, very difficult to do. So, again, people that say, I don't need to go to church, I think the first word there is what's identified their motive. I. It's all about me and what makes me happy and what I want to do. And as a believer, we don't belong to us anymore.
No, absolutely. And then, back to the idea of the body. If we're all members of the body, i.e. you got hands, you got feet, you got ears, eyes, let's say you have very clearly and rightly identified your position, what it is that God's put in you to do and what your calling is. And so you think to yourself, well, I don't need the rest of the church. I'm going to go do exactly what God called me to do. Well, inevitably, if you're doing what God put you on earth to do, you're only going to be able to attack one facet of the issue you're going after without a connection to a full body. Maybe the person that you've encountered and your calling is for ministry, maybe they've dealt with a specific trauma. Maybe they have other needs that you're not positioned to cover. And if you were connected to a body, you'd be able to bring that person into a family that is able to come around them and address all of their needs. And you've then cut yourself off by thinking, no, I've got mine and I'm going headlong into this ministry with no backup, no resources, and no diversity of options. Because I see that happening here. Someone comes in with a need, or something happens to somebody in their life, and then we've got people to just go there, love on them, and it's more than just the sense of community, is we have people with different abilities, different talents, different gifts that can actually address exactly what's pertinent to their life at that point.
Right. So if you go about a ministry on your own and you run off to do this by yourself,
Right.
again, not only are you, just in it for what's in it for you, you're not just denying the body of having that gift that God's put in you, but you're also denying the backup that you have, because somebody you may be addressing a very specific need in somebody's life that you know a little bit about outside the body, but there may be other things in other parts of their family and other people with other stuff. And you're like, oh, I don't know how to handle that. I don't know what to do with that. Well, guess what? Somebody else in the body does.
Right.
You need to be connected to a body.
Right. And if that goes on, you run the risk of having that happen, maybe going, oh man, the first time, and then you continue and you start to overesteem yourself or start to ignore other needs that people have because you don't want to admit you're wrong. You don't want to go get connected to other people. And so now you're doing a disservice and you're actually not as helpful as you might think yourself out to be, because you're going to go ahead and, Jesus talks about, seeing the person and going, oh, we're going to pray for you, hope you do well, as opposed to actually doing what's needed
Right.
for them.
Right.
Well, if you encounter somebody with a multitude of needs and you're just like, well, mine's the gift of prayer, mine's the gift of this, and you can just go, put a Band-Aid on a gunshot wound, and you don't have a hospital to bring them into and to be able to address all their needs, that you're not really helping that person that much.
That's really true. I mean, you may be a great paramedic, but you're not a surgeon. Right. And we have surgeons, spiritually in the body of Christ that you can bring. Maybe you can do the triage. Maybe you can be the first one to the accident because you've got those abilities. But that doesn't mean you're equipped to cover everything from the surgery to the rehab to the physical therapy to any of those things. That doesn't mean no man has all those gifts.
Right.
So, that's there we go. That was a long way from the Sabbath, but I think we've covered that topic, and I want to talk just a second about what's coming up. The very next time we get together for this podcast, we're going to be talking about the rest of what we see happening next in chapter 2, which is the creation of man. So we've already seen that happened in chapter 1, but now what's happening here in chapter 2?
Yeah. So, we get to chapter 2 in the beginning, and one of the things that I think is very important for everyone to remember is that the Bible was not written with chapters and verses. Somebody came along later, and I don't want to just call it arbitrary because that seems like really mean.
Yeah.
But they may not have been the most insightful placements for some of these chapters verses. So, we finished chapter 1 and we get to chapter 2. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished. I mean, it feels like that follows something, doesn't start something so much, especially when you realize day 7 is what's next. So if you take out the division and you just kind of read everything in passage and let it flow, you realize that here's the 6 days. So now the structure's done and God rests, and this is the 7th day. And then it talks about, and these are the generations of. So now what it's going to do is it's going to start to talk about the details. So, outline, now we're going to fill in, not just the bullet point outline of all creation, but we're going to start filling into the details. And the main detail that we're focusing on here is day 6, because man is a distinct and important creation. You get a sense of it in the first chapter, but God is going to drive home the uniqueness of the creation of man, the orders that he gave man, creation of woman, instituting certain very critical structures for society. It doesn't do any justice to the creation account if you skip those details. And day 1, again, or chapter 1, I should say, is just boom, 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 boom. This is what happened. Just so we're not confused about the order of operations here. Okay, but rewind for a second. This making man is kind of a big deal. Let's go look at that.
Right. So where we're going to pick up next week is basically the zoom in, the magnifying glass on day 6, the part where God created man.
Right.
All right. So you guys come back and join us again. Andy, thanks for hanging out today, and we'll do this again soon. All right.
Yes, sir. My pleasure. I love doing this.